The first thing Counselor Vethsaran noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of an empty chamber, not the meditative quiet of a deliberation recess. This was the silence of a communication array that had been transmitting on 17 frequencies simultaneously for 43 consecutive hours, and had simply stopped. No degradation signal. No carrier wave. No formal termination handshake. The array had been speaking, and then it had not, and the difference between those two states was a single heartbeat of transition that her instruments had not been fast enough to catch. She pulled the final recorded transmission onto her display. It was a human voice. It always was lately. And the last 3 words before silence were, "don't wait up." Vethsaran had been studying humans for 6 years by the time the Thrain Accord collapsed, and she would later tell the tribunal that she had never once understood them correctly on the first attempt. This was not false modesty. It was a technical assessment. The first misunderstanding had happened before she even arrived at her posting. The preliminary dossier on humanity, compiled by the Galactic Administrative Council Survey Division, was 11,000 pages long and catastrophically wrong in ways that no one had recognized precisely because it was so detailed. When a document is thorough enough, the assumption of correctness becomes nearly impossible to question. The dossier had described humans as a Class 4 developing civilization, pre-interstellar, resource-limited, politically fragmented, and militarily negligible at any scale beyond their home system. It had noted, with what Vethsaran now recognized as a devastating lack of imagination, that humanity's primary strategic liability was its biological vulnerability. Soft-bodied, short-lived, chemically dependent, neurologically unstable under sustained stress. The word used in the original Lossic was kethavori. It translated roughly as fragile by design. The survey division had not been wrong, exactly. Humans were all of those things. The dossier had simply failed to ask what a fragile species does when it decides fragility is not a reason to stop. She set down the transcript and stared at the dead array. 3 mysteries were already assembling themselves in the architecture of her mind, the way structural problems announce themselves to an engineer through vibration before they announce themselves through collapse. The first, what had the humans activated? The final transmission referenced a defense system, their words, not hers, but nothing in 11,000 pages of survey data mentioned a planetary defense array of any meaningful scale. Earth's orbital infrastructure was antiquated. Their energy generation was localized. Their weapons technology was, by any standard metric, 3 to 4 generations behind the Council's member civilizations. The second mystery was the timeline. If such a system existed and had now been activated, the humans had built it without the Council knowing. And if the Council hadn't known, that meant the humans had deliberately concealed it. And if they had deliberately concealed it, that meant they had known, for some period of time that Vethsaran could not yet calculate, that this moment was coming. Which meant they had been preparing while everyone assumed they were simply waiting to be processed. The third mystery was the smile. She had reviewed the visual capture from the final transmission 11 times before she admitted what she was seeing. The human who had spoken those last words, a woman, middle-aged by human reckoning, wearing what appeared to be a maintenance uniform rather than any diplomatic insignia, had been smiling. Not the performative smile that human diplomats deployed in negotiations. Not the fierce smile that Vethsaran had learned to recognize when council representatives made demands the humans found distressing. This was a small, private smile. The kind a person makes when they already know how a story ends. She opened a channel to High Coordinator Drelvaz. "The array is down," she said. "Technical fault," Drelvaz replied. He was already dismissing it. She could hear it in the cadence of his breathing, the slight elongation of each exhale that indicated a mind that had already moved on. The humans closed it. Deliberately. The pause. The humans don't have the authorization codes to close a council array. They appear to have not needed them. Another pause. Longer this time. "Vethsaran," he said slowly, "what exactly did the final transmission say?" She read it to him. The silence that followed was a different kind than the array's silence. The array had gone quiet because something had happened. Drel went quiet because something was beginning to occur to him that he would have very much preferred not to occur to him. "Send me the visual capture," he said finally. "I already did. Look at her face." She heard his breathing change. Not the dismissal exhale. Something more careful. Something that, in a human, she might have called the beginning of concern. "What is she smiling about?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Vethsaran said. "But I think we need to find out very quickly." The Thrain Accord had been, depending on whose historical account one read, either a rational administrative measure or the single most catastrophic diplomatic miscalculation in Council history. Vethsaran had spent considerable time on this question and had concluded that it was both, which was precisely the problem. Decisions that are simultaneously rational and catastrophic are the hardest to prevent, because everyone involved can point to their own reasonableness right up until the moment the walls come down. The accord had been proposed 16 months earlier, at the 42nd session of the Galactic Administrative Council's Expansion Directorate. The formal language was careful and bloodless. A provisional administrative reorganization of 17 contested star systems along the inner spiral arm, pending final boundary adjudication. The practical language, the language that wasn't in the official record but lived in the meeting room conversations Vethsaran had attended and wished she hadn't, was simpler. Humanity's solar system sat inside 3 of those 17 contested regions. The accord redrew the boundaries. It did so without consulting humanity. The humans had been notified, not consulted. There was a meaningful distinction there that the Expansion Directorate had chosen, very deliberately, not to examine. Humanity's response had been immediate and, by Council standards, somewhat baffling. They had not protested through diplomatic channels, though they did send formal objections. They had not threatened military action, though several member civilizations had half expected them to. The humans had a long cultural history of threatening things they couldn't actually do, which the dossier had at least gotten right. What they had done instead was go very quiet in a particular way that Vethsaran recognized, because she had studied humans long enough to know that their silence was not a neutral state. Human silence meant they were thinking. And when humans thought in that particular concentrated way, it meant they had identified a problem and were now working backwards from the solution. She had tried to explain this to the Expansion Directorate. "They're not accepting the terms," she'd told the assembled directors. "They're evaluating their options." "They have no options," Councillor Fethoam had replied. He'd said it with the absolute certainty of someone describing orbital mechanics, not an opinion, but a physical law. Their military capacity is insufficient to contest the accord by force. Their political relationships with other developing civilizations carry no weight in council chambers. Their economy is too locally contained to mount any meaningful commercial pressure. They are, by every metric we have, powerless in this matter. The word he used was the same as the dossiers. Kethavori. Vethsaran had looked around the chamber at the assembled faces of 11 civilizations, each of them nodding, each of them in possession of detailed intelligence reports compiled by survey teams who had never once asked a human what the humans were planning. "Has anyone asked them?" she'd said. The question had landed in the room like a piece of debris falling in low gravity, unexpected, and moving far more slowly than it should. "Ask them what?" Thum had said. "What they're doing. What they're building. What they've decided." The silence that followed was not the silence of consideration. It was the silence of people who have not asked a question because the answer seemed too obviously predetermined to be worth the time. The accord passed. 16 member civilizations in favor. 1 abstention, Vethsaran's own, which she'd filed quietly and which had been noted in the record and promptly ignored. 2 months later, the construction anomalies began. The survey satellites were the first to report it, and the first reports were filed under geological activity, seismic events detected across 17 discrete locations on Earth's surface, all of them occurring within a 6-hour window. The locations were geographically strange. Not clustered along fault lines. Not concentrated in regions of known volcanic activity. They were distributed with a precision that no natural process would generate, roughly equidistant, forming a pattern that the survey team's pattern recognition software initially misidentified as agricultural infrastructure. Farming. They had looked at 17 massive construction events across a planet that was supposedly complying with administrative reorganization, and their software had classified it as farming. The pattern is consistent with large-scale subterranean installation, Vethsaron told Drelvaz when she escalated the anomaly. The energy signatures don't match anything in the agricultural database. What do they match? She'd looked at the data for a long moment before answering. Nothing. We don't have a reference category for it. Drelvaz had authorized a deeper scan. The deeper scan had found the installations, and the installations had found the scans, and 3 of the survey satellites had experienced simultaneous navigational failures that deposited them into non-recovery orbits. The humans hadn't said anything. They hadn't taken credit, hadn't sent a formal notice, hadn't done anything at all except go slightly quieter than before. They shot down our satellites, Drelvaz said, staring at the loss reports. They redirected them, Vethsaron corrected. No weapons discharge registered. The navigational systems simply stopped responding to commands. He stopped. Recalibrated. They don't have that technology. She said nothing, because this seemed like the kind of moment where saying apparently they do would be less effective than the silence that meant the same thing. A rapid reevaluation was ordered. New data requests were sent to every survey team operating in the human system. The returns came back with unsettling consistency. Power generation readings across Earth's surface were increasing in 17 locations simultaneously. The energy type was unfamiliar. The rate of increase was steady and patient, the signature of something that had been building for a long time and was approaching completion. And that was the moment Vethsaron's second misunderstanding collapsed into something considerably worse than misunderstanding. She ran the timestamp on the earliest detectable energy signatures. Buried under months of data, beneath the geological noise and the survey categorization errors and the sheer, compounding weight of 11,000 pages of assumptions, the signatures had begun 22 days before the accord was proposed. Not after the accord passed. Before it was proposed. The humans had not been reacting to the Council's decision. They had been responding to something else. Something they had known was coming before the Council had even raised the formal motion. Her hands were very still on her console as she sat with this for what felt like a long time. They knew, she said aloud to no one. They knew before we did. The question, Vethsaron said, and she was in Drelvaz's chamber now, standing rather than sitting because she needed to be standing for this, is not what they built. The question is what they were responding to. Drelvaz looked at the timestamp correlation she had placed in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. Intelligence leak, he said. Someone on the Council? No. The earliest signatures predate the accord by 22 days, but the accord motion was only drafted 15 days before proposal. If they had a Council informant, they would have acted after the leak, not before the motion existed. They anticipated the motion. That's not possible. It's what the data shows. Then the data is accurate, she said. I've verified it 6 times. He stood and moved to his window. Beyond it, the administrative station's orbital view showed the distant pinprick of Sol, a yellow dwarf, unremarkable in every way that the survey teams had found useful for classification and catastrophically remarkable in every way they hadn't thought to measure. How? He finally asked. I think, Vethsaron said carefully, that they have been watching us longer than we have been watching them. I think they understood what the Expansion Directorate's movements in that sector meant before the Expansion Directorate had formalized its own intentions. And I think that when they saw what was coming, they didn't wait for confirmation. They started building immediately. She paused. They have a word for it. I came across it in the Xenolinguistics archive. The word is contingency. Drelvaz turned from the window. A contingency for what? For the moment, she said, when being classified as powerless stopped being a disadvantage and became something they could use. The silence in the room was the longest kind. The kind that meant everything was changing. The communication system on his desk pulsed. It was the array monitoring station. The array had gone silent. And somewhere on a planet 11 light-minutes away, a woman in a maintenance uniform was smiling. The first thing the defense grid did was nothing. This confused everyone enormously. The council had assembled an administrative enforcement fleet. The language was always careful about this. Always. Enforcement, not military, administrative, not punitive, 17 vessels of varying scale, positioned at what the fleet commander, a Thrain named Osekpral, had calculated as a safe deterrence distance from the human system. The fleet's orders were to maintain presence while the council formalized the transfer of administrative authority over the contested regions. This was a standard procedure. The fleet was not there to fight. It was there to make the option of fighting seem structurally irrational. The humans had looked at the fleet. The fleet had looked at the humans. The humans had activated 17 installations simultaneously. And then nothing happened. No weapons discharge. No energy beam. No projectile. No electromagnetic pulse. No interference with the fleet systems. The 17 locations lit up on every sensor array the fleet possessed, burning with power output that Osekpral's technical staff quietly admitted they had no good explanation for, and then they simply held. The energy signatures were stable. Waiting. They're bluffing, Osekpral transmitted to the council. Vethsaran was listening to the fleet communications from her station. She heard the certainty in his voice and felt, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, that she was watching someone walk confidently toward a door that was not what it appeared to be. They're not bluffing, she transmitted back on the open channel where he would have to acknowledge it. They haven't fired. No. They haven't interfered with us in any way. No. Then what? Osekpral said, with the patience of someone who considers themselves to be explaining something obvious. Are they doing? Vethsaran looked at the energy signatures on her display. She looked at the pattern they formed across the globe. She thought about the word contingency and about the woman's smile and about 22 days of construction that had begun before anyone had given the humans a reason to build. I think, she said slowly, they're waiting for us to make the next move. And I think they know what it is. We are going to proceed with the administrative transfer, Osekpral said. The installations are irrelevant if they do nothing. Fleet Commander. Her voice was quiet, careful. In 6 years of studying this species, every time I have concluded that something they were doing was irrelevant, I have been wrong. I want to formally recommend. Your recommendation is noted, he said, which was the administrative phrase for your recommendation is over. He advanced the fleet. What happened next happened in 47 seconds, and Vethsaran watched all 47 of them in real time, and afterward she would describe it in her testimony to the tribunal and no one would fully believe her until they reviewed the sensor logs. And even then several of them would spend a long time staring at the logs in the way that people stare at things they can see but haven't yet found a way to believe. The installations didn't fire on the fleet. They fired on the space between the fleet and Earth. 17 simultaneous discharges of a coherent field energy type that the Council's physics database had 2 partial theoretical descriptions of and 0 practical applications recorded, and the energy didn't travel toward the fleet. It traveled around the system. The discharges connected at pre-calculated intersection points in empty space, forming a geometric lattice that enclosed the entire human solar system in the time it took Osekpral's tactical officer to say, "What is?" and stop. The lattice wasn't a weapon. The fleet's sensors spent 11 seconds trying to classify it before returning a category that had never been applied to a defensive installation in recorded galactic history. It was a boundary. A hard physics boundary. A region of altered spacetime geometry, stable and self-sustaining, that the fleet's drives could not penetrate without structural consequences the engineering team described, with visible discomfort, as unpredictable but significant. The human solar system was, as of 47 seconds after Osekpral had advanced, on the other side of a wall that the Council had not known was possible. Osekpral's transmission to the Council was 7 words. We cannot proceed. We cannot go around. Vethsaran sat in the quiet of her monitoring station and looked at the energy signatures on her display, still burning, still stable, still patient, And she thought about every assumption that had been made about a fragile species with no meaningful capacity for resistance, and she felt something she rarely felt in professional contexts. She felt the particular vertigo of understanding that arrives too late to be useful. The humans had not built a weapon. They had built a wall. A wall so precisely constructed that it required no ongoing maintenance, no crew, no command signal to sustain. It simply was, now, a feature of local spacetime, as permanent and inarguable as gravity. And they had built it not in response to the fleet's arrival but 22 days before the motion that had sent the fleet was even conceived. They had known a wall would be needed. They had built it before anyone gave them a reason to need it. And then they had waited, with that particular human quality that the dossier had somehow managed to observe without understanding, the capacity to wait not because they were helpless, but because they were ready. Veth Saran. Drel Vaz's voice on the channel. Assessment. She looked at the boundary. She thought about the woman's smile. They're not powerless, she said. They've never been powerless. We just decided they were, and they let us. Why would they let us believe? Because a species that everyone believes is powerless, she said, can build a wall across space-time in complete secrecy while 17 survey civilizations file their activities under geological events and farming. The silence on the channel was absolute. There's something else, she said. What? The boundary is one-directional. She heard him process this. Meaning, the fleet can't go in. The humans can come out. There was a woman named Sarah Vasquez who had spent 11 years in Earth's Contingency Infrastructure Division, which was a department that officially didn't exist and unofficially had a budget larger than most member civilizations' entire defense allocations. She was 43 years old, had 2 children, held a doctorate in applied space-time geometry that she'd completed in secret under a research classification that even her thesis committee hadn't fully understood, and wore maintenance uniforms because she had found, over 11 years, that people paid less attention to you when they thought you were there to fix something rather than build it. She was the woman who had been smiling. She was sitting in the monitoring center beneath what the council's surveys had logged as a geothermal energy test site when the boundary locked in, and she watched the fleet's sensor pings try and fail to cross the lattice geometry, and she felt something that she would describe later to a journalist as not quite pride and not quite relief. More like confirmation, she said. You build something like this, you spend years not knowing if the math is actually right. And then it either works or it doesn't. And if it hadn't worked? The journalist asked. Sarah considered this. Then we'd have had to try something else. The journalist looked at the boundary data on the display in front of them. What else was there? Sarah smiled the same small, private smile. She didn't answer. Back in the monitoring center, the moment the boundary locked, she opened a channel to her team leads at all 17 stations. She didn't make a speech. She had never been a speech person. Seal confirmation received, she said. Start the clock on phase 2. Because the boundary wasn't the final defense. It was the first one. Phase 2 is where the council made its third misinterpretation, and this one was the most consequential because it came directly from the one piece of human behavior that should have taught them better. The council, having absorbed the shock of the boundary, convened an emergency session and, in an admirably short time, did something genuinely reasonable. They proposed negotiations. Real ones this time, not notification, not consultation. The logic was sound. The boundary changed the military calculation entirely. The Accord's enforcement was now physically impossible, and the pragmatic path was to open a dialogue that acknowledged the new reality. They transmitted a formal request for communication through a deep space relay that they were fairly sure the humans couldn't intercept. They were wrong about that. The human response arrived in 4 minutes, faster than the speed of light if the relay distance was correct, which meant either the relay distance was wrong or the humans had a node inside the council's own communication network. The tribunal would later spend 8 months investigating which. The answer was both. But the response itself was what concerned Vethsaran. It was a single data package. No voice. No diplomatic preamble. No opening statement of position. Just sensor logs. Council sensor logs. Classified data from 17 different survey missions over the past 6 years. Internal communications from the Expansion Directorate. Meeting transcripts. Draft versions of the Accord, including the earliest working draft, the one that no one had admitted to remembering, which contained a line, later deleted, that described the human solar system as expendable for administrative purposes. The humans had all of it. Every assumption. Every dismissal. Every moment someone had said Ketha Vori and moved on. They had collected it with the careful patience of people who expected to need it one day and had wanted to be prepared. They've been inside our networks, Drel said. He sounded, for the first time in Vethsaron's experience of him, genuinely frightened. For how long? She said. The oldest file in the package is dated. He stopped. She heard his breathing change again. 7 years. 7 years. 1 year before Vethsaron had taken her posting. 4 years before the first survey teams had flagged any concern about human technological development. 7 years ago, when humanity had been Class 4 developing, resource-limited, politically fragmented, and by every classification metric in existence, powerless. They hadn't been powerless 7 years ago either. The sensor logs were followed by a single line of text, in Lassic, written with the grammatical precision of a species that had spent 7 years studying the language. Asterisk, we have the room for a conversation. We would prefer to have one. Asterisk. Vethsaron read it 3 times. She translated the subtext once, and that was enough. Asterisk, we have evidence of what you intended. We have a defense you cannot breach. We have been inside your systems longer than you knew we existed as a threat. And we are still choosing to talk, asterisk. That was the phrase that mattered. Still choosing. Not willing to, not open to, still choosing, the word that implied an alternative they were holding in reserve. She opened a direct channel to the human monitoring station. The response came in 6 seconds. Audio only. This is Director Vasquez. Director, Vethsaron said, I would like to speak plainly. I appreciate that, the woman said. Her voice was calm in the particular way of someone who has had a long time to rehearse being calm for this specific moment. Go ahead. How long have you known this was coming? The pause. Not the pause of consideration, the pause of someone deciding how much to say. My team's first analysis flagged the Expansion Directorate's survey patterns 7 years ago, Vasquez said. The pattern was consistent with pre-administrative reorganization data collection. We've seen it before, in the historical records of other civilizations the Council absorbed. We recognize the shape of it. And you didn't say anything. We said quite a lot, Vasquez replied, and there was something in her voice now, not anger, but something adjacent to it, worn smooth by time. We submitted 4 formal inquiries through the Diplomatic Liaison Office. We requested clarification on survey activity in contested regions. We asked, very specifically, whether any administrative boundary changes were under consideration. We received 4 responses stating that no such changes were planned. Vethsaron was very still. I was not aware of those inquiries. No, Vasquez said. I suspected you weren't. The beat. So we stopped making inquiries and started making preparations. The simplicity of it landed like a physical thing. They had asked. They had been lied to. And rather than escalate through a system that had already demonstrated it wouldn't hear them, they had gone quiet and built. Director, Vethsaron said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I am asking as myself, not as a representative of the Council. Understood. The boundary is one-directional. We can't go in. You can come out. Yes. Phase 2, she said. The clock your team started. What is it? The pause this time was longer. Long enough that Vethsaron began to wonder if she'd overstepped, if the conversation was over, if she'd just spent her credibility on a question that would close the door. Then Vasquez said, It's a timer. For what? For how long we wait for a real conversation before we start having a different kind. Vethsaron's hands were still on her console. The same stillness as when she'd run the timestamps. The same quality of sitting inside a realization that was still expanding. How long on the timer? Vasquez's answer was quiet, almost gentle. You have 19 days. The Council's emergency session lasted 4 days. It was, by all accounts, the most fractious deliberation in recent administrative history, which was a meaningful achievement for a body that had 17 civilizations worth of opinion on every question. The argument was not about whether to negotiate. Everyone agreed, rapidly, that negotiating was better than the alternative, an alternative they still hadn't fully quantified, which was its own source of discomfort. The argument was about what to concede, what to offer, and most critically, what to admit. It was Fethum who raised the question that everyone else had been maneuvering around. If we acknowledge the accord was unjust, he said, we establish a precedent. We establish a precedent, Vethsaran replied, or we let the humans establish one for us. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said poorly. What does that mean? Fethum asked. It means, she said, that in 19 days, now 15, if we haven't reached an agreement, Director Vasquez's team starts whatever Phase 2 is, and we find out what Earth's second line of defense looks like. And given that we were completely unprepared for the first one, I would prefer not to experience the second one as a surprise. She looked around the chamber. They had 7 years to build this. They had our survey data, our internal communications, and 4 lies in writing to motivate them. What do you think they spent the rest of the time on? The silence that followed was the most productive kind. The kind that meant people were thinking rather than reacting. The vote to open full negotiations passed in 14 minutes. Vasquez was at the boundary monitoring station, not the main installation, a secondary site in what the old geography called Northern Canada, where it was currently snowing in a way that she had always found calming when the formal council delegation request arrived. She had a cup of coffee in her hand. The coffee was real, ground from actual beans, an extravagance she allowed herself on significant days. She called her senior team together in the small conference room that smelled permanently of circuits and old insulation. They've requested a formal session, she said. Full diplomatic credentials. Acknowledge the boundary. No preconditions. Her chief engineer, a man named Okafor who had built 3 of the 17 installations and slept under 4 of them during the construction phase, leaned back in his chair. What are our preconditions? We don't have any. He blinked. We're going in with no preconditions? We're going in with the boundary, she said. We're going in with 15 days still on the clock. We're going in with 7 years of their communications in a file they know we have. Those aren't preconditions. Those are the room. Okafor thought about this. And Phase 2. Vasquez took a slow drink of her coffee. Phase 2, she said, stays on the clock. Even during negotiations? Especially during negotiations. He nodded slowly, the understanding moving across his face, the recognition that the timer wasn't a threat and wasn't a bluff and wasn't leverage in the conventional sense. It was a fact of reality. The way gravity is a fact of reality. You don't negotiate with it or against it. It simply continues whether or not you acknowledge it. They're going to ask what it is, he said. Yes. What do you tell them? Vasquez set down her coffee cup. Outside the window, snow was falling in the gray late afternoon in a way that made the world look very simple and very old. I tell them, she said, that Phase 2 is what happens when a species that everyone decided was powerless runs out of patience. And that we've been patient for a very long time. The negotiation lasted 9 days. Vethsaran led the council delegation. She had requested the position specifically, in writing, with the argument that of everyone in the council's diplomatic structure, she was the one who had been wrong the fewest times about humanity, which was not the same as being right, but was, she noted, the closest thing to expertise available. The sessions were long. Some of them were difficult. Some of them were the kind of conversations that leave marks you don't notice until later, when you're trying to sleep and find that certain sentences keep recurring. On the 6th day, Vethsaran asked the question she had been working toward since the first transmission. The installations, she said. 17 locations, equidistant distribution, the lattice geometry. The boundary has been in place for 11 days now. It is, as far as we can determine, permanent. Vasquez, across the table, watched her steadily. When you built it, Vethsaran said, you built something irreversible. You changed the physical structure of local spacetime. Permanently. She paused. Was that a deliberate choice? A very long pause. Yes, Vasquez said. Why? Vasquez's hands were folded on the table. Her expression was the composed, careful expression of someone who has thought about a question for a long time and is now, at last, answering it to the person it was meant for. Because, she said, we needed you to understand that we weren't negotiating from desperation. We weren't asking for protection. We weren't hoping you'd be reasonable. She held Vethzeron's gaze. We were telling you that this is where we live, and we built something that reflects that permanence, because we needed you to feel it the way we feel it. Not as a threat. As a fact. Vethzeron absorbed this for a moment. You altered space-time to make an emotional point. We altered space-time, Vasquez said, because it was the only language we had found in 7 years that you couldn't reclassify as geology or farming. There was a beat of silence. Then, for the first time in 6 years of studying humans and being consistently and instructively wrong about them, Vethzeron laughed. It was a short sound, involuntary, the kind that escapes before the professional reflex can catch it. Vasquez looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite surprise. That's fair, she said quietly. The accord, the real one, the one that was negotiated rather than imposed, was signed on the 9th day. It took the form of a mutual recognition framework that acknowledged Earth's sovereign administrative authority over its system, established a formal embassy structure, and contained, in its preamble, a line that Vethzeron had drafted herself and that the Council had accepted after minimal debate, perhaps because most of them suspected she would cause more trouble if they didn't. The parties acknowledge that preparedness is not the same as aggression, and that silence is not the same as compliance, and that a species existing quietly within a classification has not necessarily accepted it. The Expansion Directorate removed the word category from the active survey taxonomy. They reclassified all Class 4 developing civilizations for reevaluation. The reevaluation process took 18 months and produced 17 separate cases of what the resulting report called significantly underestimated latent capability, which was the administrative phrase for, we made the same assumption about several other species, and we may want to find out, before they tell us, what they've been building. The boundary remained. It remains to this day, a feature of local spacetime in the Sol system, stable, self-sustaining, unmanned, a permanent record of a deliberate act by a species that had been classified as fragile and had found a way to make that classification useful until it wasn't needed anymore. Vethzeron wrote a revised assessment of humanity. It was longer than 11,000 pages and substantially shorter, in the sense that every page said less than it thought it was saying and was honest about that limitation. She submitted it to the survey division with a cover note that read, "Asterisk, this document is a beginning, not a conclusion. Do not treat it as the other kind, asterisk." She did not know, when she wrote that note, whether anyone would listen. But she had learned, from watching humans, that the value of doing a thing correctly does not depend on knowing in advance whether it will be heard. In the secondary monitoring station in northern Canada, in a room that smelled of circuits and insulation, Sarah Vasquez stood at the window long after her team had gone home and the negotiations were complete and the timer had been stopped with 3 days still on the clock.